They laughed at my boy. Then I walked through the door.
Kids are cruel because they have not yet learned how to hide it. Cole Briggs had known this since first grade when Marcy Pollard told him his lunch smelled like a gas station and the entire table laughed. He had known it in second grade when the substitute teacher mispronounced his last name and Harlan Voss corrected her in a voice loud enough for the whole class to hear, dragging out the vowel in a way that made it sound like something small and ridiculous. He had known it every single day of third grade, sitting in the third row of Mrs. Harmon's classroom at Sycamore Ridge Elementary in Harlan, Montana, pressing his knees together under his desk and keeping his eyes on his shoes. The canvas on his left sneaker was fraying at the toe. A thin strip of white fabric had peeled back from the rubber sole, and if he looked at it long enough, he could see the gray of his sock beneath. He picked at it with a bitten fingernail. The linoleum floor was cold through the thin rubber of his soles, even in April, because the heating in room 3B had never worked the way it was supposed to, and Mrs. Harmon kept a small electric space heater behind her desk that only really warmed the front quarter of the room. Cole sat in the back quarter. He had known about career day for 3 weeks. The flyer had come home in his backpack on a Tuesday, printed on yellow paper in a font that tried too hard to look cheerful, little cartoon briefcases dancing along the border. Cole had read it once, folded it in half, then folded it again, then stuffed it into the deep interior pocket of his backpack where permission slips went to die. He had not mentioned it to his father. He told himself it was because his father was busy. Reed Dalton was always busy. There was always something in pieces on the garage floor. Some engine pulled apart and laid out on a tarp. Some brother from the club who needed a favor. Some run being planned, some dispute being handled in the quiet way his father handled things, which was to say without much talking and with a great deal of finality. Reed Dalton did not have time for yellow flyers with dancing briefcases. But that was not the real reason Cole kept it folded in the dead pocket of his backpack for 3 weeks. The real reason was simpler and more shameful than that. Cole knew his father would come, and he did not want him to. The morning of career day arrived gray and flat, the way April mornings in Montana tend to arrive, with a sky the color of old dishwater and a wind that found the gaps in your jacket. No matter how tightly you pulled it closed, Cole ate cereal standing at the kitchen counter because the table still had engine parts on it from the weekend. His father had been up since before dawn. Cole could hear the radio in the garage, the low staticky murmur of a country station that Reed kept tuned to a frequency that barely came in, as though the slight difficulty of reception made it feel more earned. Cole poured his bowl at it, standing, rinsed the bowl, and left for school without saying anything. This was their morning routine. It had been their morning routine for as long as Cole could remember. His father worked. Cole got himself to school. The garage was where Reed lived in the truest sense, the way some men live in their offices or their studies, and Cole had learned early that you did not interrupt a man when he was in the place where he lived. He walked the 6 blocks to Sycamore Ridge with his backpack straps cutting into his shoulders and his breath making small white clouds in the cold air. He thought about the flyer the whole way. He thought about whether his father might have forgotten. Then he thought about whether Reed Dalton had ever forgotten a single thing in his entire life, and he knew the answer to that. Room 3B smelled the way it had always smelled: dried Elmer's glue, the faint chemical bite of fresh dry erase marker, the underlying institutional soap scent of every school hallway in America. Mrs. Harmon had rearranged the desks into a semicircle facing the front, which she only did for special occasions, and she had written Career Day on the whiteboard in her precise, evenly spaced block letters, underlining it twice. Mrs. Harmon was a woman who believed in presentation. She wore a cardigan the color of dried sage and a sensible skirt, and her hair was pulled back in a way that had probably not changed since 1987. She was not a cruel woman. Cole had decided this years ago and never revised his opinion. She was simply a woman whose world had very clear edges, and anything that fell outside those edges created in her a specific kind of anxious discomfort that she managed by becoming more precise, more clipped, more procedural. Cole was in her world a source of low-grade procedural difficulty. He took his seat in the third row and watched the other kids filter in. Harlan Voss came in with his usual entrance, the door open a full 3 seconds before he appeared in it, as though he needed the room to arrange itself around his arrival. He was a compact boy, well-fed in the particular manner of children from comfortable households, with clean sneakers that his mother replaced every semester and hair that lay flat because someone had combed it that morning. He sat in the front row because that was where he always sat, and he immediately turned around to survey the room the same way he surveyed everything, as though assessing what he already owned. His eyes found Cole in the third row. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The looking was enough. The presentation started at 9. Mrs. Harmon introduced each parent with a small biography she had clearly prepared in advance, reading from index cards in a way that suggested she found this just as tedious as the children did, but had committed to the performance anyway. Harlan's father went first. Clifton Voss was a tall man with the kind of groomed authority that comes from years of being the most important person in every room he entered. He was a family lawyer in a county where most families needed one eventually, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man whose phone was always ringing. He stood at the front of the room in a suit that cost more than most people in Harlan made in a month, and talked about contracts and mediation and the importance of communication, and he had brought a prop, a small gavel, which he tapped once on Mrs. Harmon's desk at the end for emphasis. The class applauded. Harlan led the applause. After Clifton Voss came a dental hygienist named Brenda, who brought oversized plastic teeth in a giant toothbrush and demonstrated the correct angle of approach with the exhausted patience of someone who has explained this 10,000 times. After Brenda came a man named Dale Kepper, who managed inventory for the hardware supply company out on Route 12, which was not a glamorous job, but which Dale explained with a quiet, genuine pride that Cole found unexpectedly moving. After Dale came a woman named Annette Pierce, who was a physical therapist at the clinic on Mercer Street, who talked about anatomy and movement and the satisfaction of helping someone walk again after they thought they could not. And Cole listened to Annette more carefully than anyone else because she talked about her work the way his father talked about engines, which was not often, but with a contained ferocity that made clear it mattered more than most things. "All right," Mrs. Harmon said, checking the clock on the wall above the whiteboard. The clock was encased in a wire cage. Cole had always found that strange caging a clock, as though time itself needed to be contained. "We have time for one more before our morning break." "Cole," she looked at him. "Your father said he might stop by today." The room did not move. Cole felt the blood climb his throat and settle in Siayuan. He pressed his knees together under his desk. He looked at the fraying canvas on his left shoe. He said, "He might be late. Speak up." "Please, Mrs. Harmon said, not unkindly. "He might be late," Cole said louder, and the words tasted like something he had to push out manually, like moving furniture. Harlan Voss turned around from the front row. His face wore the specific expression he wore when he had found something and intended to use it. "A biker," he said to no one in particular and everyone at once. "His dad is a biker." There was a brief evaluative silence from the class. Cole could feel them calculating. Then someone in the back said something about motorcycles, and someone else made a wet sputter with their lips, and the laughter started small and then was not small anymore. It was not vicious laughter in the way that adult laughter can be vicious. These were 8- and 9-year-olds who had not yet learned to sharpen cruelty into a clean point. It was the laughter of children who had found something incongruous and had not yet been taught to conceal their reaction. But it landed on Cole the way all such laughter lands on the soft parts, and the soft parts did not have much room left. Harlan did not laugh. He turned further around in his seat, propping his elbow on the back of his chair, watching Cole with the steady, interested gaze of someone waiting to see what a cornered animal will do. "That is enough," Mrs. Harmon said, clapping her hands twice with a sound like a mousetrap. The laughter stopped. She looked at Cole with an expression he recognized and hated, the soft-eyed, slightly tilted expression of a woman who felt sorry for something and was trying not to show it. "I am sure your father does very interesting work, Cole. If he is able to make it, we would love to hear from him. And if not, that is perfectly all right too." The perfectly all right too was the worst part. It was the sound of someone removing something from the possibility column while trying to be gentle about the removal. Cole looked back at his shoe. The morning break came, and Cole stood at the far end of the playground near the chain-link fence and watched the other kids run and shout with the effortless ease of children who had not spent 3 weeks carrying a folded yellow flyer in a dead backpack pocket. The wind came off the foothills, cold and direct. It smelled like thawing ground and diesel from the highway. When they came back inside for the second half of the morning, Mrs. Harmon had returned the desks to the regular arrangement and moved back to standard curriculum. Cole sat at his desk with a worksheet in front of him, a community helpers page with neat line drawings of a firefighter, a mail carrier, a doctor with a stethoscope. He stared at the page without seeing it. He traced the edge of the paper with his finger, back and forth, following the small irregularities in the cut. There was no drawing of a man with a scarred jaw and hands stained permanently with grease, wearing a leather vest decorated with the arched lettering of a motorcycle club. There was no box on the worksheet for a man who settled things in gravel parking lots at 2 in the morning. Behind him, a sneaker scuffed against the linoleum. Then the back of his chair moved, just slightly, just enough. Cole gripped the edges of his desk. "Hey," Harlan said from behind him. His voice dropped to the register kids use when they want to be heard by the target, and only the target. "Where is the motorcycle man? Did he forget you existed?" Cole pressed his pencil into the worksheet hard enough that the paper dimpled. "Maybe he got lost." Harlan continued with the same flat testing tone. "Maybe he cannot read street signs." Cole's pencil snapped. The crack was sharper than he expected. The broken tip tore a short, dark gash through the cartoon doctor's face, and Cole dropped both halves onto the desk and shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans, balling them into fists. He stared at the ruined worksheet. The cartoon doctor smiled up at him through the tears split in half, still optimistic. And then the floor moved. It did not begin as a sound. Cole felt it first through the soles of his sneakers, a faint, rapid vibration traveling up through the concrete foundation of the school and into the legs of his desk. He straightened. He pulled his hands from his pockets. At the front of the room, on the corner of Mrs. Harmon's desk, her large, clear water thermos sat in its usual place. Cole looked at it. The surface of the water was trembling. Tiny concentric rings moved outward from the center, touching the sides of the container with a persistence that meant whatever was causing them was not stopping. A low frequency entered the room. It was not loud, not yet. It was a pressure, the kind of sound you feel before you properly hear it, a baritone throb that had no place in the sterile acoustic box of room 3B. It was the sound of combustion, of compression of machinery, built to be violent, operating at full capacity. It pressed against the double-pane classroom windows. Mrs. Harmon stopped talking. Cole had never seen her stop mid-sentence before. She stood at the whiteboard with a marker in her hand and simply stopped, her head tilting toward the windows, the way a person tilts their head towards something they cannot yet identify. The vibration in the floor intensified. The windows began to rattle in their aluminum frames, a thin metallic chattering. The water in the thermos was no longer forming rings, but sloshing gently against one side. Then the sound arrived fully. 3V twin engines, their exhaust notes layered over each other in a low rolling thunder that had no ceiling and no apology. The fluorescent lights hummed as though responding. The wire cage around the clock vibrated. A poster of the water cycle tapped against the cinder block wall, with each pulse of sound a slow, patient knocking. The classroom dissolved into heads turning toward windows. Children stood up without permission. Chairs scraped. Mrs. Harmon said something about remaining seated, but the sound swallowed her words before they reached the back of the room. Cole sat completely still. He knew that sound. He had grown up with it as the background music of his entire life, had fallen asleep to it, and on summer nights, when his father came home late, had learned to count the approaching engines the way other children counted sheep. 1, 2, 3. The smell hit the room through the cracked windows a half-second later. It came on a push of warm, displaced air, and it was the smell of unburnt hydrocarbons, of hot metal and road grime and old leather. To everyone else in the room, it was a chemical assault, sharp and alien. 3 kids in the front row actually covered their noses. To Cole, it smelled like his father's jacket thrown over the back of the kitchen chair. It smelled like Saturday mornings in the garage. It smelled like every good thing he had ever been ashamed of. His heart was hammering. He felt it in his hands, in his throat, and in the tips of his ears. He did not stand up. He did not move to the window. He sat in his desk in the 3rd row and waited for what came next. The 3 engines cut simultaneously. The silence that followed was enormous. It was the silence after thunder, the silence of something very large, suddenly absent. Cole's ears rang. The tapping poster went still. The water in the thermos leveled. Mrs. Harmon's face had gone the color of dry chalk. She stood at the front of the room with her marker still uncapped, held at her side, the tip slowly bleeding a thin blue line down her palm. Her eyes were on the classroom door. Down the hallway out of view, the main entrance doors hit their frames with a sound like a starting gun. Then the footsteps. They were nothing like the sound of sneakers on linoleum or the click of a teacher's heels. They were heavy and deliberate and paced with a kind of unhurried authority that made the floor itself seem to accommodate them. Each step landed with the full weight of a man who had not spent a single day of his adult life concerned with the volume of his presence. Engineer boots on polished tile. And between each step, the low rhythmic jingle of a steel chain against denim steady and patient. The children who had gone to the windows came back to their desks without being told. Something in the approaching sound made them want to be small and seated and accounted for. The footsteps stopped outside room 3B. Through the narrow reinforced glass in the classroom door, a shadow fell across the corridor light. Not a thin shadow, a wide one, the kind that fills the available space completely. The door handle turned. Mrs. Harmon took a step backward and her hip caught the corner of her desk. A red pen rolled off the edge and hit the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up. The door opened slowly and with complete conviction, the hinges protesting with a long metallic groan. And Reed Dalton stepped through it. He had to duck. Cole had seen his father duck through doorways his entire life and had never thought much about it, but watching him do it now in room 3B, with 30 pairs of third-grade eyes on him, was different. The frame barely cleared his shoulders. He straightened on the other side, and the room changed around him, the way rooms change when something real and large enters them. He was built the way working men are built after decades of actual labor. Not the performed thickness of a gym, but the functional mass of a body that has been used continuously, compressed into density by years of lifting and wrenching and hauling and being out in weather that did not care whether you were ready for it. His arms below the cut sleeves of his undershirt were cabled with muscle and covered in ink that had faded to the blue-green of old bruises, skulls, and daggers, and words Cole had asked about once and not asked about again. A scar ran down the left side of his neck, thick and puckered, disappearing beneath the frayed collar. The vest was what took the room's attention. It was black leather, heavy and stiff-creased, white at the seams from years of being worn in all weather. The patches on the front were small and specific. The patch on the back was not small. The red and white arched lettering of the Iron Saints MC stretched across shoulders wide enough to carry something real. And below it, the small, unambiguous symbol of the 1% diamond that meant this man did not operate within the mainstream of anything. He brought the smell with him, amplified exhaust and highway wind, and the particular closed-space staleness of a garage in winter. And it entered room 3B and did not apologize. Behind him, filling what remained of the doorway, Boone and Dax stepped in. Boone was tall and angular with a gray beard that reached his sternum and dark aviator glasses he had not removed despite being indoors. He was chewing a wooden toothpick with slow deliberation, the way a man chews a toothpick when he has nowhere he needs to be faster than here. Dax was shorter and built like a fire hydrant, completely bald, with thick, dark ink wrapping his throat and the backs of both hands. Neither man crossed his arms. Neither looked concerned about anything. They flanked Reed with the unconscious ease of men who had stood in doorways together many times before, and their hands hung loose at their sides, and their eyes moved slowly over the room with the quality of attention that comes from having spent years reading spaces quickly. 30 children forgot how to breathe. The silence was absolute in the way that very few silences are absolute. No pencil scratching, no chair shifting. Even the space heater behind Mrs. Harmon's desk seemed to have reduced its output. Reed's pale blue eyes moved across the room with a slow, methodical quality. He scanned the rows. Cole watched him scan. Watch those eyes move past Mrs. Harmon, past the alphabet border, past the water cycle poster, still slightly off-kilter from the engine vibration across each row, until they found the third row and stopped. Cole was looking directly at his father. He had not realized he was holding his breath until he let it out. Reed's face was what Cole's face would look like in 35 years. If 35 years of sun and wind and unrevocable decisions were applied to it. The jaw was heavy, the lines deep, the skin along the neck weathered to a permanent reddish brown. There was no softness in it as a category of feature, but something shifted in it, a microscopic reduction in the grinding tension along the jaw, a slight ease around the eyes, the kind of change you could miss entirely if you were not a boy who had spent 9 years learning to read that face. "Hey, kid," Reed said. His voice came from somewhere below his chest. It was too large for the room, and it knew it, and it did not care. "Hey, Dad," Cole said. His voice cracked on the second word. Reed walked down the center aisle. The children on either side pulled their arms in close to their bodies as he passed, every child pressing themselves fractionally backward in their seats. His boots left faint gray impressions on the waxed linoleum. He walked without hurry, without performance, the chain at his hip catching the fluorescent light as it swung. He stopped at Cole's desk. He reached out his right hand, the knuckles scraped pink and raw from something recent and unspoken, and placed it flat on Cole's shoulder. The weight of it was immediate and real. It was the weight of a hand that had fixed things and broken things and built things and carried things, and it settled on Cole's shoulder with a completeness that felt like a declaration. Not a tender declaration, not the kind that uses soft words, the kind that simply states a fact in the presence of witnesses. "This is mine." Reed turned his head and looked at Mrs. Harmon. She appeared to be managing very carefully a small personal crisis. Her hands had moved to the collar of her cardigan. She had gone from chalk-colored to a pinkish flush that was the color of controlled panic. "You the teacher," Reed said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said, her voice a half octave higher than normal. "I am Mrs. Harmon," she swallowed. "Can I help you?" Reed reached into the inside of his vest. Mrs. Harmon's hands went to her collar again. He withdrew a piece of paper folded into quarters, the creases gone white from being folded and unfolded many times. He held it out. She took it with 2 fingers, pinching the corner, and opened it. It was the yellow flyer. The dancing briefcases along the border were faded now, and one of the creases had torn slightly, but it was legible. It was the same flyer that had lived in the dead pocket of Cole's backpack for 3 weeks, and it was in his father's hand, which meant his father had found it, which meant his father had known all along. Cole felt something shift in his chest that he could not have named. "Career day," Reed said simply. "Got the notice. Told my boy I would be here." Mrs. Harmon looked at the flyer for a moment with the expression of a woman renegotiating her understanding of a situation in real time. Then she said in a voice that had found some of its professional architecture again, "Of course. We were just finishing up. Please make yourself comfortable." Reed did not appear to have any relationship with the concept of making himself comfortable. He turned back to the room and looked at the semicircle of terrified, fascinated children with the expression of a man surveying a landscape he has been hired to cross. Then he looked at Harlan Voss. Harlan was in the front row, which meant he was close. He was also the only child who had not moved during Reed's walk down the aisle, which might have looked like bravery from a distance. From the third row, Cole could see that Harlan's hands were flat on his desk, pressing down hard the way you press down on something when you need it to stay in place. Reed held Harlan's gaze for 3 seconds. Cole counted them. He had learned to count his father's silences the way you learn to read weather. 3 seconds was not an accident. 3 seconds was a message sent at a frequency only children receive clearly. Harlan looked away. He looked at his desk. He looked at his hands. He did not look up again. Reed turned back to the room. He reached into the deep front pocket of his jeans, and every child in the room watched the motion with complete attention. His hand came out holding a piece of metal roughly cylindrical, about the size of a large coffee mug, gray and mottled with baked-on carbon, its surface marred with a deep lateral gouge that had taken the finish down to bare metal. He held it in his palm, and it sat there with the casual density of something that has been part of a violent process for a long time. He walked to Mrs. Harmon's desk and set it down on her stack of graded Community Helpers worksheets. It landed with a heavy solid clunk. A dark circular grease stain spread outward from the base immediately. Mrs. Harmon looked at the stain. She said nothing. "This is a piston," Reed said, turning back to the room. "Out of an 80 cubic inch Evo motor. This is what makes the bike move. His voice was not raised. He did not project the way Clifton Voss had projected, filling the room with the practiced resonance of a man accustomed to closing arguments. Reed spoke at the same volume he would have used across a workbench, slightly too low for the room's dimensions, which meant the children had to lean forward almost imperceptibly to hear him. Most of the people who came in here today, Reed continued, told you about how they sit in offices, how they talk to other people in offices, how they write things down and then other people read the things they wrote. He paused. World needs that. But out on the road, none of that matters. A business card does not fix a blown gasket when you are on the shoulder of Route 2 in January. He moved to the center of the room. Being part of a club is not a job, Reed said. He stopped and addressed the room at large with the flat certainty of someone who does not require agreement. It is a life. It means you do not rely on anybody except the men who wear the same patch. He hooked a thumb over his shoulder at Boone and Dax. That is Boone, that is Dax. My bike goes down at 3 in the morning and they come. My door is open, they walk through it. Somebody disrespects me, they stand with me. He said the word disrespects at the same flat volume as everything else, and somehow that made it heavier. Harlan was looking at his desk. An engine needs 3 things to run, Reed said. He held up 3 thick fingers. Fuel, air, spark. Take away one and the machine dies. A club is the same. Loyalty, respect, brotherhood. Mrs. Harmon cleared her throat with a small, determined sound. Mr. Dalton, she said, perhaps we might focus on the more mechanical aspects for the children. Reed looked at her. He turned his head and looked at her for a moment that was not hostile, but was not accommodating either. It was the look of a man deciding whether something is worth addressing. Sure, he said. He walked back to the desk and picked up the piston. He held it under the fluorescent light. This piece of metal runs at hundreds of degrees, moves up and down thousands of times a minute, pure violence inside a contained space. He turned it. The light caught the deep gouge in its side. The only thing keeping it from destroying the engine is the fit. The fit has to be right. He ran a thick fingernail along the gouge, and the scraping sound made several children wince. This one did not fit right. He paused, left me stranded. He walked to the front row and set the piston down in the center of Harlan's desk. Pass it around, Reed said. Harlan reached out with one hand. The piston did not move. He picked it up with both hands. His wrist dipped under the weight. The grease transferred to his fingers, immediately dark and irreversible. Heavy, Harlan said. His voice was barely a sound. Things that matter usually are, Reed said. The piston began its circuit around the room. Cole watched it move, desk to desk, each child lifting it with both hands, each child surprised by the weight, each child smelling the sharp burn smell and then passing it on. It moved through the rows with the gravity of something being shared that could not be taken back. When it reached Cole in the third row, he took it without adjusting his grip. His hands already knew the temperature and the texture, the way the carbon baked into the surface felt under the pads of his fingers. He turned it over and found the gouge and traced it with his thumb and set it on the corner of his desk. Reed was watching from the front of the room. Cole looked up at his father. Reed looked back at his son. There was no performance in it, no sentiment being demonstrated for the room. It was the kind of looking that happens between two people who have lived in the same space long enough that certain things require no words at all. Reed checked the heavy silver watch on his wrist. Burning daylight, he said to the room. He pushed himself off Mrs. Harmon's desk and walked back up the center aisle. Boone and Dax stepped aside at the door in a single synchronized movement without a word passing between them. At the threshold, Reed stopped. He looked back at Cole. See you at home, kid. Cole's voice was steady this time. The tightness in his throat was gone. Bye, Dad. Reed gave a single nod. He stepped into the hallway. Boone and Dax followed. The heavy classroom door swung shut behind them, and the latch clicked into place. The footsteps receded down the hall. Nobody in room 3B moved. Mrs. Harmon stood at her desk and looked at the grease stain on her community helpers' worksheets. She picked up a tissue and touched it, and then set the tissue in the waste bin with the careful precision of a woman deciding to release something. Then the engines fired. All three at once, a sudden, violent return of the sound that had announced their arrival. The wire cage around the clock vibrated. The water cycle poster tapped the wall. The thermos sloshed. Mrs. Harmon closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples. The engines revved a sharp, tearing sound, then dropped into gear and began to move. The rumble faded down Sycamore Drive, the sound bending slightly around the buildings at the end of the block, stretching thin and then gone. The ticking of the cage clock came back. The silence that filled the room was completely different from the silence that had preceded Reed's arrival. Before, it had been the silence of children waiting for a punchline. Now it was the silence of children who had encountered something real and did not yet know what to do with it. "Well," Mrs. Harmon said. Her voice had lost its professional cheerfulness and found something raw underneath. She smoothed the front of her skirt with both hands. That was a very unique perspective on mechanical engineering. She did not look at Cole. Cole looked at the piston still sitting on the corner of his desk. He picked it up and put it in his backpack. It hit the bottom with a solid thud. He looked at Harlan in the front row. Harlan was facing forward. There was a dark smudge of grease on the bridge of his nose where he had rubbed it without thinking, and he had not noticed. His father's glossy business cards were scattered on the floor around his chair where he had knocked them during the preceding hour. He did not pick them up. Harlan caught Cole looking. The smirk was gone. The careful architecture of dominance that Harlan maintained constantly and automatically was gone. What was in its place was something young and unguarded and slightly lost. Harlan looked away first. The bell rang. The class stood up into it with the careful quiet of children who have been somewhere and come back. They gathered their things and filed out in something close to order, casting looks at Cole's desk as they passed, not mocking looks, just looks. Cole took his time. He waited until the room was nearly empty. He zipped his backpack over the weight of the piston and stood up and adjusted the straps and walked to the door. In the hallway, the air smelled of lunch being prepared somewhere in the building, warm and starchy and institutional. But Cole pulled a slow breath through his nose and found underneath it, faint but present, the remaining trace of exhaust and leather and highway. He did not try to identify the specific feeling this produced in him. He was 9 years old, and the vocabulary for it would come later. He walked down the hall and out into the gray April morning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of specific detail that Cole would remember for the rest of his life, the way people remember the day of the week when something changes. He found out about it not from his father, not from Mrs. Harmon, but from a boy named Garrett Finch, who sat 2 rows over and whose older sister worked the front desk at the school district office 3 afternoons a week. Garrett told him at lunch in the cafeteria between bites of a peanut butter sandwich, with the toneless efficiency of a child delivering information he does not fully understand but recognizes as significant. "Your dad is getting investigated," Garrett said. Cole set down his fork. "Harlan's dad sent a letter to the principal and the school board. Says your dad threatened kids." Cole looked at his tray. The mashed potatoes had a small pool of butter melting in the center. He watched it spread slowly toward the edge. He did not say anything to Garrett. He finished his lunch and carried his tray to the window and walked back to class and sat at his desk and opened his reading workbook to the correct page and read none of it for the rest of the afternoon. He did not tell his father that night. He told himself this was because Reed came home late after 9 and Cole was already in bed. He could hear the garage door, the familiar sequence of sounds, the engine cutting, the door rolling up, the particular silence of a man moving through a dark house who knows the layout by memory. These were the sounds of every night of Cole's life, and they were in their way a kind of comfort. He lay in the dark and listened to his father move through the kitchen, the soft complaint of the refrigerator door, water running briefly, and then the creak of the house settling under the weight of a large man sitting down somewhere. Cole stared at the ceiling and did not say anything. The next morning he told himself again that he would say something. He ate cereal standing at the counter. The engine parts from the previous weekend had been moved off the table and onto a folded tarp on the floor, which meant Reed was making a concession to order that he only made when something was occupying concentrated mental space. Cole looked at the parts on the tarp. He thought about saying something. He did not say anything. He went to school. The thing about carrying a secret that involves another person is that it changes the way you see that person. Cole began to watch his father with a different kind of attention in the days that followed, looking for the stress points, the way you look for cracks in something you know is under pressure. Reed did not seem to know about the letter. He moved through the house and the garage in his usual manner, the same economy of motion, the same silences. He made dinner 3 nights out of 5 that week, which was more than usual, and the dinners were bad. And the way Reed's dinners were always bad, things from cans combined without ceremony, but they were present on the table at a reasonable hour, which Cole understood was its own kind of statement. On Thursday evening, Reed asked Cole how school was. Cole said it was fine. Reed looked at him for a moment with those pale, calibrated eyes and then nodded and went back to his food. Cole spent that night at the small desk under his bedroom window with a composition notebook open in front of him. The notebook was not new. He had bought it in September with quarters he found in couch cushions and dimes from the laundromat floor. He had been writing in it on and off since the second week of school. In the top drawer of that desk, there was also something else he had found 3 months ago, a tin box. He had discovered it on the shelf behind the parts cleaner in the back of the garage on a Saturday morning when Reed had been on a run and Cole had been alone in the building. He had not been looking for anything. He had been looking for a rag and had moved things on the shelf, and the tin had been there pushed to the back behind a can of carburetor spray and a stack of old gaskets. He had opened it. Inside was a photograph of a boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing beside a dirt bike in a field somewhere, squinting into the sun. The boy had Reed's grown and Reed's pale eyes and a grin that was entirely his own. There was a name written on the back of the photograph in handwriting Cole did not recognize. Danny, and beneath it a date now over 15 years past. There was also a folded piece of newspaper in the tin, a clipping. Cole had unfolded it and read the first few lines and then folded it again and put it back and replaced the tin behind the carburetor spray and the stack of gaskets and had not touched it again. He had not said anything to his father about it. He had not known what to say or whether there was anything to say or whether some things were simply not meant to be spoken about directly, but were instead meant to be carried in the way you carry things you have found and not been given quietly without display. He opened the composition notebook now to the first entry. September 9th. Harlan pushed me into the lockers outside the gym. Marcus Delacroix saw it. The hall was empty except for us and Marcus. He read through all 22 entries slowly. He had recorded each incident with the same spare factual format, date, description, names of anyone present. He had not been dramatic. He had not editorialized. He had written the things that happened in the plain functional words of a 9-year-old who had decided somewhere along the way that if you kept a record of what was real, then what was real could not be argued away. He had started the notebook for a reason he could not have articulated clearly at the time. It was not revenge exactly. It was more like a refusal to let the weight of things press down without any counter-pressure. If something happened and no one recorded it, then in a certain sense it could be said not to have happened, and Cole had found this idea unacceptable in a way that was larger than his ability to explain it. He read to the last entry. It was dated the day of career day. After school, Harlan was by the fence. He did not say anything mean, he just stood there. He told me his dad hits him when his grades are bad. He said it the same way he says other things, just regular. I did not know what to say, so I just listened. I wrote it down because I did not know what else to do with it. Cole closed the notebook. He sat at the desk for a long time after that, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the faint staticky music from the garage below and the wind moving through the gap in the window frame. He thought about Harlan standing by the fence, saying something in a regular voice that was not regular at all. He thought about hands hanging at the sides, the way hands hang when a person has put something down and does not know where to put their hands next. Then he put the notebook in the front pocket of his backpack under the broken pencil sharpener and the folded math worksheet and the spring concert permission slip he had been meaning to bring home for a week. The following week, on a Wednesday morning, Cole came downstairs to find the kitchen table cleared completely. Nothing on it at all, which Reed only did when something was going to happen at the table. A glass of orange juice had been set at Cole's usual spot. His father sat at the opposite end with a mug of coffee and a piece of paper flat in front of him. Cole stood in the doorway. Reed looked up. He said, "Sit down." Cole sat down. Reed pushed the piece of paper across the table. Cole looked at it. It was a letter on district letterhead requesting Reed Dalton's presence at a parent-teacher conference regarding an incident on April the 14th at Sycamore Ridge Elementary. The language was careful in the specific manner of documents designed to move something without naming it directly. Cole read it twice. He pushed it back. Reed watched him. Cole reached into his backpack, which he had not yet taken off, and removed the composition notebook. He set it on the table and slid it across. Reed looked at it. He looked at Cole. Then he picked it up and opened it. He read it the way he read everything, completely without expression, each page receiving full attention before he turned to the next. Cole sat across from him and drank the orange juice in small increments and listened to the sounds of morning outside, a truck downshifting on the highway, a dog on the next block, the ordinary world continuing its work while something inside this kitchen rearranged itself. Reed read for 11 minutes. He turned the last page. He read the last entry. Cole watched his father's face receive that entry, the one about Harlan by the fence, and saw something happen around the eyes. Not a softening or a hardening, but a kind of stilling, the way still water registers something passing through it from below without breaking the surface. Reed closed the notebook. He placed one hand flat on top of it. His hand covered most of the cover. He sat without speaking for a while, and Cole waited because he had learned that his father's silences were not empty. They were working silences and interrupting. One was like opening an oven before the thing inside was done. Then Reed said, "How long have you been keeping this?" "Since September," Cole said. Reed nodded once. "You did not tell me." Cole looked at his orange juice. "No, why?" Cole turned his glass on the table, a small, precise rotation. He thought about the honest answer. He gave it because giving the dishonest answer to his father had always felt like leaving a tool in the wrong place, a disruption of the order of things. "Because I did not want you to think I could not handle it myself." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You handled it better than most men I know." It was the longest single compliment Reed Dalton had ever given his son. Cole received it by looking at his glass and not saying anything, which was under the circumstances the correct response. Reed stood up. He picked up the composition notebook and his coffee mug. He said, "I will be at that meeting." He walked back to the garage. The door settled behind him with its familiar click. Cole sat at the table a moment longer. Then he picked up his backpack and went to school. The meeting was on a Friday afternoon, the 5th week after career day. Cole was not invited to attend, which was both a relief and a specific kind of torment. Not being present meant not knowing what was happening in real time, but it also meant not sitting in a room with Clifton Voss and whatever he had prepared. Cole knew Clifton Voss had prepared something. A man like Clifton Voss always prepared something. He was a person whose professional identity was the architecture of situations, the building of advantageous structures from available material. He did not walk into rooms without having already understood them. Cole sat in his classroom for the last period of Friday and worked on long division and watched the cage clock and thought about the conference room down the hall. What Cole did not know and would not learn until later was what Boone had brought with him. Boone, who had stood at the door of room 3B on career day, chewing a toothpick without apparent concern for anything, had spent the 2 weeks preceding the meeting doing something Cole had no framework for at 9 years old. Before joining the Iron Saints, Boone had spent years as an investigator for a regional insurance fraud division, a fact that sat oddly beside his gray beard and his patch, but which his brothers had found occasion to find useful more than once. Boone had made calls. He had looked at public records and school district documents in the kind of paper trail that accumulates around every institution if you know how to follow it. He had found that Harlan Voss had 3 documented disciplinary incidents in the school system, 1 in 1st grade and 2 in 2nd, all involving physical contact with other students. And that one of those 3 incidents, a 2nd grade incident witnessed by 2 students and a classroom aide, had been removed from the active disciplinary file approximately 8 months prior. The timing corresponded to a period when Clifton Voss had been retained by the school district on a separate matter involving a property boundary dispute. Boone put this in a folder. He sat in the back corner of the conference room in the 2nd chair from the wall, a position that placed him outside the central sightlines but gave him a clearer view of everyone present. When Clifton Voss's private attorney looked at him with the expression of someone who has found an unexpected variable, Boone simply looked back and said nothing. Clifton Voss opened the meeting with a prepared statement, measured and serious, built with the care of someone who had written it out and memorized the key passages. He used the word threatening twice and the phrase inappropriate environment once and the phrase duty of care 3 times. He was very good at this. He had the voice of a man accustomed to being the most credible person in any room. Principal Blevins sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man whose container for the situation had proven too small. Reed sat across from Clifton Voss with his hands flat on the table. He was wearing the vest. He had placed his Montana driver's license on the table when asked for identification and left it there. He had not said anything yet. When Clifton Voss finished, Mrs. Harmon described the career day event in careful, precise language. The language of a woman who had spent 2 weeks deciding exactly which words to use. She used the word intimidating and then, after a brief hesitation, said she would characterize the experience as unusual. Then Principal Blevins looked at Boone and asked who he was. Boone removed the toothpick from his mouth. He said his name and said he was there as an observer. Then he placed the folder on the table and opened it and slid the contents toward Principal Blevins without ceremony. Blevins looked at his contents. The attorney leaned forward. Blevins picked up the top sheet which documented the 3 disciplinary incidents and read it. He set it down. He picked up the second sheet which showed the timeline of the removed incident and the district's concurrent retention of Clifton Voss as legal counsel. He read this one more slowly. The conference room was very quiet. Then Blevins did something no one at the table had scripted. He picked up the composition notebook which Reed had placed on the table when he sat down, and he opened it and he began to read it aloud. He read from the first entry. September 9th. He read each entry in the plain, steady voice of a man reading a document into the record. No dramatic emphasis, just the dates and the descriptions and the names of the witnesses. 22 entries in the handwriting of a 9-year-old boy who had spent 7 months writing down what was real so that it could not be argued away. Clifton Voss's attorney stopped leaning forward about 4 entries in. Clifton Voss himself sat back in his chair somewhere in the middle entries, the October and November ones, and did not lean forward again. When Blevins reached the last entry, the one about Harlan by the fence, he stopped. He read it again to himself. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the table and looked at Clifton Voss without speaking. Clifton Voss looked at the table. His attorney said something quiet to him. Clifton Voss shook his head. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his folder of prepared materials, which had not been opened, and put it under his arm. He said in a voice that had lost most of its architecture, "We will be in touch with the district through proper channels." Then he walked out. His attorney followed. The conference room was quiet for a moment. Then Reed picked up his driver's license and put it in his wallet. He picked up the composition notebook. He stood and nodded once at Principal Blevins, who nodded back and walked out. Boone put his folder together in the original order and followed. Cole was sitting on the low brick wall beside the school's main entrance when Reed came through the doors. He had been sitting there since the bell rang 40 minutes earlier, his backpack between his feet, watching the entrance, the way you watch for something you cannot hurry. Reed came down the steps and stopped in front of his truck. He looked at Cole on the wall. Cole looked at his father. Reed said, "Get in." They drove in silence out past the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the road opened into flat grassland, the foothills blue and distant to the west. The truck's heater was working a low rush of warm air from the vents. The dashboard had a crack along the top that Cole had been looking at his entire life. Cole waited. He had learned the shape of his father's silences well enough to know when one was working towards something. After a few miles, Reed said, "Your notebook. How did you decide to start keeping it?" Cole looked out at the grassland moving past. "I did not want things to happen and then not be real anymore," Cole said. Reed kept his eyes on the road. Cole turned and looked at his father's profile, the heavy jaw, the long scar on the neck, the pale eyes under the brim of a cap washed so many times its original color was a matter of conjecture. He thought about the tin box on the shelf in the garage. He thought about the photograph of the boy with Reed's jaw and Reed's pale eyes and the grin that was entirely his own. He said, "Dad, did you ever have someone like that? Someone who kept track of things for you?" Reed was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody," he said. His voice was flat in the way of a statement that has been compressed by time into something very small and very dense. Cole looked back at the road ahead. A hawk sat on a fence post at the shoulder, watching the truck pass with the absolute stillness of something that does not need to hurry anything. They drove another mile. Then Reed said, "I had a son before you." Cole said nothing. He waited. "His name was Danny," Reed said. He kept both hands on the wheel, his posture unchanged, his voice at the same low volume it always was. He was 14. I was not there when he needed me to be there. I was somewhere I should not have been, and I could not get to him in time. Cole kept his eyes on the road. I have had to decide every day since then, Reed said, whether I was going to be the man who was not there or a different man. He said it without drama, without the weight of confession or the request for absolution. He said it the way he stated what happened to an engine and why it failed, plain and factual and without decoration. Cole said, "Is that why you came on career day?" Reed said, "One of the reasons." Cole nodded. He thought about Danny standing beside a dirt bike in a field somewhere, squinting into the sun with a grin that was entirely his own. He thought about the name written on the back of the photograph in handwriting that was not Reed's. He thought about what it meant to be 14 and not have your father be able to get to you in time, and what it cost a man to carry that forward into every subsequent day of his life. He thought about 22 entries in a composition notebook and his father reading them at the kitchen table with one hand flat on the cover afterward. He thought about the way his father had walked into room 3B without being asked, ducking through the doorframe and straightening on the other side, and how he had spent 3 weeks being afraid of that moment, and how the fear and the relief had turned out not to be opposites at all. He did not say any of this. He was 9 years old and he did not yet have all the words for it, but he felt its shape and weight the way you feel something real in your hands before you can name what it is. They came back into town from the North Road, past the grain elevator and the implement dealer and the diner with the peeling sign, and Reed turned onto their street and pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. They sat in the truck. Cole said, "Do you think Danny would have liked motorcycles?" Reed looked at the steering wheel. Something moved across his face, a passage of something large and interior, like weather observed at a distance. He said he would have. He said it quietly and with the certainty of a man who knew his son. He would have loved them. Cole nodded. They got out of the truck. Reed went to the garage. Cole went inside and stood at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the yard, at the dead grass beginning to green at the edges, at the fence with the loose post that Reed kept meaning to fix. Through the kitchen window, he could see the rectangle of light from the open garage falling across the driveway in the early evening. The radio came on the staticky country station, barely coming in. He stood there a while listening to the music. Then he went to his room and took out a new composition notebook from the drawer of his desk, a blue one this time, and he opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top in his even, careful handwriting. He sat for a moment with the pen in his hand, looking at the blank page. Then he began to write. The garage door was still up when Harlan Voss appeared at the end of the driveway. It was a Saturday morning in the 6th week after career day, and Cole was sitting on an overturned milk crate just inside the garage entrance, doing homework on a piece of plywood balanced across his knees. Reed was somewhere under the front end of a 1987 Softail that belonged to a club brother named Kellerman, visible only from the boots down. The radio murmured on its barely there station. The air smelled of oil and cold concrete, and the first real warmth of a Montana May coming through the open door. Cole looked up from his long division and saw Harlan standing at the end of the driveway holding a bicycle. He had not been invited. There had been no conversation that led to this. Harlan was simply there in jeans and a green jacket, holding the bicycle by the handlebars, the chain hanging loose and dark against the front fork. He stood at the property line with the specific posture of someone who has traveled a distance and is now uncertain about the last few feet. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then Cole stood up, set the plywood on the milk crate, and walked to the end of the driveway. He did not think about why he was doing this. He had already done the thinking at a different time and in a different place, sitting at his desk reading the last entry of his composition notebook. What remained now was just the walking. Harlan looked at him. He looked at the garage. He said, "The chain came off." Cole looked at the chain. He said, "Come in." Harlan walked the bicycle up the driveway and into the garage. Reed's boots shifted slightly under the Softail. Cole went to the wall where Reed kept his tools on a pegboard, each tool outlined in black marker, so you knew exactly where it lived and knew immediately when something was missing. He found the chain tool and brought it back. He crouched in front of the bicycle and looked at the chain. It had come off the rear sprocket and jammed slightly against the stay. He worked it loose with his fingers, got it back over the sprocket, checked the tension. The tension was low. He stood. You need to tighten the rear axle bolts, Cole said. He got the right wrench from the pegboard and came back and worked the bolts on both sides evenly, checking the wheel for center. He spun the wheel. It ran true. He stood and handed the bicycle back to Harlan. Harlan took it. He looked at the chain now seated correctly and at the wheel running straight. He wrapped both hands around the handlebars. From under the soft tail, Reed's voice came out flat and even. Chain needs oil about once a month. More if you are riding in the rain. Harlan looked at the boots under the motorcycle. He said, "Yes, sir." The boots did not move. Reed said nothing else. Cole went back to his milk crate and picked up the plywood in his long division worksheet. He did not tell Harlan to stay. He did not tell him to leave. He sat back down and looked at the worksheet. Harlan stood with the bicycle for a moment. Then he walked it to the side of the garage near the wall, not in the way of anything, leaned it there and sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the wall. Cole worked on long division. Reed worked on the softail. The radio played something with a steel guitar. Nobody said anything for a long time, and the silence was not uncomfortable, in the way that silences between people who have wronged each other are often uncomfortable. It was the silence of a space that had been offered and entered and was now simply being occupied. Cole had grown up in this garage, and he knew its silences the way he knew its light. The angle of the afternoon coming through the west-facing window. The way the dust in the air became visible in that light, the specific hum of the fluorescent overheads that you stopped hearing after the first 10 minutes. Harlan sat against the wall and watched Reed's boots move under the softail. At some point, Reed rolled out to get a different socket, and he looked at Harlan on the floor the way he looked at most things, directly and without excessive commentary. He selected the socket he needed and rolled back under. Harlan said from the floor, "How do you know which one to use?" Reed's voice came from under the motorcycle. "You listen to what it needs and you use what fits." Harlan was quiet a moment. He said, "How do you know what it needs?" Reed said, "You do it enough times, you know." Cole did not look up from his worksheet, but he heard something in Harlan's voice during that exchange that he had never heard from him in 2.5 years of sharing a classroom, the sound of a question that was genuinely a question and not a performance of one. Harlan left an hour later, walking his bicycle back down the driveway and mounting it at the street. He did not say thank you. He did not wave. He rode away. Reed came out from under the softail for the last time that day and sat up and wiped his hands on a shop rag. He looked at the end of the driveway. Cole watched his father think. Reed said, "You knew about the father." Cole said, "He told me." Reed nodded. He folded the shop rag with automatic precision. He said, "You let him in anyway." It was not a question. Cole said, "Yeah." Reed looked at him for a moment. Then he stood and went to wash his hands at the utility sink, and Cole went inside to finish his homework at the kitchen table, and the evening did its ordinary work. Harlan came back 2 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon, the bicycle chain seated correctly, the rear wheel tracking straight. He leaned it against the same wall and sat in the same spot on the floor. Reed was working on a different machine this time, a pan head taken apart to the frame and being rebuilt from there. He did not acknowledge Harlan's arrival verbally. He handed him a bolt. He said, "Hold that." Harlan held it for 20 minutes while Reed worked around it. Then Reed took it back and installed it and moved to the next thing. At some point, he handed Harlan a rag and told him to wipe down the primary cover. Harlan wiped it with the focused, slightly over-careful attention of someone doing something for the first time and trying to learn by doing. Cole came out after his homework was done and found Harlan wiping the primary cover and Reed working on the carburetor. He sat on the milk crate and watched, and none of them talked much. When Reed told Harlan he was holding the rag wrong flat instead of getting into the seams, Harlan did not argue or sulk. He adjusted. He paid attention. This was a version of Harlan Voss that Cole had not known existed. A boy who could be quiet. A boy who could follow instruction. A boy who was capable of sitting on a concrete floor for 90 minutes doing what he was told, and finding this in some way Cole could not precisely name restful. That evening, when Harlan was getting his bicycle to leave, he looked at Cole and said, "I told my mom about the notebook." Cole looked at him. Harlan said, "She told someone at the school. I do not know what is going to happen." Then he rode away. Cole stood in the driveway a moment. Then he went inside and told his father. Reed was at the kitchen table with coffee, his boots off, which was the most relaxed version of his father that existed. He listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, Reed picked up his coffee and drank from it. He said, "You did right keeping the notebook." Cole said, "I know." Reed looked at him. The faintest thing moved at the corner of his mouth. He said, "You have known that the whole time." Cole said, "Yeah." Reed set down the cup. He said, "Good." Cole went to his room and did not lie awake that night, worrying about what would happen with Harlan and his father in the school. He had done what he could do, and he had written it down, and he had let someone else carry it forward. He was beginning to understand the full extent of what any one person could do. He did what was in front of him. The rest was the rest. He slept. 2 more weeks passed. The school year moved toward its end, with the particular acceleration of May, the days getting longer and warmer, the low, restless hum of children who can smell summer, the way animals smell weather. The disciplinary proceedings at the district level were handled in offices and through correspondence without Cole present or involved. Harlan came to the garage 3 more times. Each visit he knew a little more about what he was doing. By the 4th visit, he had stopped overhandling the tools and had learned to listen before he touched something to understand what the machine required before reaching for anything. Reed never praised him. He never criticized beyond necessary correction. He simply allowed him to be in the space and to learn what the space offered, which was considerable, and which had nothing to do with motorcycles specifically, and everything to do with the quality of attention you brought to something that required your full presence. One afternoon, Cole watched Harlan trying to locate the source of a tick in the panhead's top end, with Reed standing beside him describing what to listen for without pointing at anything. And Cole thought about the entry in the composition notebook, the last one, and he thought about how a person could be one thing in one context and a completely different thing in another, and how the first version of a person you encounter is not always the real one, and sometimes it is not even close. The district writing competition was announced in the 3rd week of May. Mrs. Harmon distributed the entry forms in class with the brisk efficiency of someone who believes in the exercise, even if the outcome is uncertain. The prompt was open right about someone who has shaped the way you see the world. Cole took the form home and set it on his desk and looked at it for one evening without writing anything. He was not struggling with the subject. He had known what to write about the moment he read the prompt, with the immediate certainty of an answer that has been forming for a long time without announcing itself. He was struggling with how to write about it truthfully, which is a different and harder kind of struggle. He started with the hands. He started there because the hands were the most honest place to start. The part of his father that was most entirely his father. The part that had done everything and showed everything and concealed nothing. He wrote about the grease that lived in the whorls of the fingerprints, regardless of how long Reed scrubbed at the utility sink. He wrote about the calluses built up on the pads of the fingers from decades of gripping things that required gripping. He wrote about the scar on the back of the left hand running from the knuckle of the middle finger to the wrist at a slight diagonal, a permanent record of something that had happened before Cole existed and that his father had never explained and Cole had never asked about because some records do not need annotation to be understood. He wrote about watching those hands on career day, setting the piston down on Mrs. Harmon's desk, with the flat certainty of a man who does not require permission for what he is about to do. He wrote about the weight of one of those hands on his shoulder in the 3rd row of room 3B, how it felt like an anchor dropped in the right place, how it felt like a declaration made in the presence of witnesses without a single word. He wrote about the hands reading the composition notebook at the kitchen table, the way they stayed flat and still on the surface while the eyes moved across the pages, the controlled stillness of a man receiving information that costs him something to receive and receiving it anyway. He wrote about the hands on the steering wheel on the drive back from school, both of them at the top, though the knuckles going slightly pale at the grip during the silence, before Reed said the name Danny and the way they eased again after. He wrote the last sentence and read it back to himself once sitting at his desk in the late May evening, with the window open and the smell of warming ground coming in, and the sound of the garage radio barely audible from below. The sentence was, "My father's hands have never held a briefcase, but they have never once let me fall." He read it twice, then he put the paper in his backpack. He turned in the entry the next morning. The 3 weeks between submission and the awards ceremony passed in the ordinary way of waiting periods, filled with the texture of days that are building toward something you cannot hurry. Cole finished third grade. He received a B+ on his final math assessment, which was better than he expected, and a near-perfect mark on reading comprehension, which was not. On the last day of school, he cleaned out his desk and found at the back of it one half of the pencil he had snapped on career day. He held it in his hand a moment, feeling the clean break at the end where the graphite had torn through the wood and then dropped it in the waste bin. Harlan came to the garage twice more in the final weeks of school. The second to last time he stayed 3 hours and helped Reed install a new primary chain on the panhead, handing tools and holding parts with the steady patience of someone who has stopped performing anything and is simply present. When he left that evening, Reed watched him walk his bicycle down the driveway and stood in the garage entrance for a moment before turning back to the workbench. That night at dinner, which was soup from a can and bread from a bag, and perfectly serviceable, Cole said, "Do you think he will be okay?" Reed dipped his bread in the soup. He thought about it in the complete way he thought about things without filling the space with preliminary sound. He said, "I think he knows where to go when he needs somewhere real." Cole said the garage. Reed said, "Yeah." They finished dinner. Reed washed the bowls and Cole dried them and put them in the cabinet, and the evening settled into its ordinary shape of Reed in the garage and Cole in his room and the radio barely coming in and the Montana night doing its dark work outside the windows. The awards ceremony was on a Thursday evening in the last week of May, held in the gymnasium of Sycamore Ridge Elementary. The gym had been arranged with folding chairs and a temporary podium and a banner reading Annual Student Achievement Awards in letters that grew slightly compressed toward the right end, as though the person making the banner had misjudged the space. Cole sat in the third row of student chairs with his hands in his lap. The gym smelled of floor wax and rubber and the institutional warmth of a building full of people on a mild spring evening. He had not looked behind him. He did not need to. He had heard the engine arrive in the parking lot 7 minutes before the ceremony began. A single Softail, the particular idol of a machine maintained by the man who built it, identifiable among any number of engines, the way a specific voice is identifiable in a crowd. He had heard it cut off and heard the lot go quiet and had not turned around. He sat in the third row and listened to the principal read the names of the geography recipients and the math achievement recipients and the attendance recipients, each category announced and applauded in the gymnasium's formal civic rhythm. Mrs. Harmon came to the podium for the writing awards. She stood for a moment before beginning, straightening her note cards with the deliberate motion of a woman taking a breath without visibly taking one. She looked at the student section, and then at the parent section, and then back at her cards. She said the prompt this year asked students to write about someone who has shaped the way they see the world. She paused. We received entries of real quality. The committee was thorough. The first place submission was written by a third grade student, and it is in the judgment of the committee among the most accomplished student essays this competition has received in several years. She looked up. The first place award goes to Cole Briggs. Cole stood and walked to the podium. He accepted the certificate, which was printed on heavy cardstock with a gold seal in the corner, and shook Mrs. Harmon's hand. She held his hand a moment longer than the handshake required. She said quietly, "I owe you an apology for April." Cole looked at her. She was entirely outside the edges of her usual world, and she knew it, and she was standing there anyway. Cole said, "It is okay, Mrs. Harmon." She nodded once. She released his hand. He went back to his seat with the certificate. Mrs. Harmon looked at her note cards. Then she looked up at the gymnasium. She said, "With the permission of the student and his family, I would like to read the closing lines of the first place essay." She unfolded a piece of paper. The gymnasium was quiet in the specific way of a room full of people choosing to be quiet, the effortful, collective stillness of an audience that is paying attention. Mrs. Harmon read, "My father's hands have never held a briefcase, but they have never once let me fall." The gymnasium did not erupt. It did not applaud immediately. There was a moment of held silence, the silence of something landing and being absorbed. And then the applause came, and it started at full volume because nobody waited to see if it was appropriate. Cole looked at his certificate. In the back right corner of the parent section in the last row, Reed Dalton sat in a folding chair with his vest, in his boots, in his chain, and his hands resting on his knees. He had changed nothing about himself to be there. He was entirely himself among a gymnasium full of people who were in various degrees presenting versions of themselves, and his presence had the same quality. It had always carried the quality of something real that has no interest in asking the room's permission. He was not applauding. His hands were still on his knees. He was looking at his son. The man sitting beside Reed, a broad-shouldered man in a flannel shirt whom Cole did not recognize, looked over at him. He nodded once, the quiet nod of one man, acknowledging something in another man that he recognizes because he has felt some version of it himself. Reed nodded back, that was all. No words were necessary and none were offered. The ceremony continued. There were more categories, more names, more applause in the gymnasium's careful civic progression. Cole sat with his certificate in his lap and watched the proceedings with the particular calm of someone who has been waiting for something to happen and has now watched it happen and can rest. An hour later, the ceremony ended, in the gymnasium lobby filled with the mild shuffling current of parents and teachers and the coffee and cookies social that follows such events. Cole stood near the door with his certificate and watched people move through the space and thought about nothing in particular. Reed came through the gym doors and stopped beside him. They stood together for a moment watching the room. Reed said, "You want a cookie?" Cole looked at the table with the cookies. They were the flat, slightly overdone kind from a catering tray, and they had been on the table long enough to firm up at the edges. He said, "Not really." Reed said, "Me neither." They stood there another moment. Cole said, "Did you know, before tonight, what the essay was about?" Reed said Blevins sent a copy to the house. Cole nodded. He turned the certificate over in his hands. There was already a fingerprint smudge on the gold seal. He said, "The last line, did you think it was true?" Reed was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lobby, at the people moving through it, at the folding table with the coffee urn and the cookies and the families doing the ordinary work of being together in a public space. He said, "Yeah," quietly without decoration. "I think it is true." Cole folded the certificate once along the center crease and put it in his jacket pocket. They walked out through the lobby and through the main entrance and across the parking lot. The May evening was cool and clear. The kind of Montana night where the stars are present in real number. The sky, very dark and very large in the way it is large in open country, where there is nothing between you and the horizon. Reed's Softail sat at the edge of the lot away from the cars, the chrome catching the orange light of the parking lot fixtures. Cole stood beside it while his father put on his jacket. He looked up at the stars. He thought about Danny. He thought about a boy he had never met and would never meet who had Reed's jaw and Reed's pale eyes and a grin that was entirely his own, standing beside a dirt bike in a field somewhere, squinting into the sun. He thought about what it meant to carry someone forward with you into every subsequent day of your life, not as a weight exactly, but as a presence, a permanent part of the architecture of who you had decided to become. He thought about the tin box on the shelf behind the carburetor spray. He thought about the photograph inside it and the name on the back and the date. He thought about his father deciding every day to be a different man than the one who had not been there, and about what it cost to make that decision daily without ceremony, without anyone watching or recording it. He did not say any of this. Some things you carry quietly because they are most real when carried that way, without asking anyone to witness the weight. Reed swung his leg over the Softail and settled his weight onto it, the suspension compressing slightly under him. He looked at Cole standing there in the parking lot with the stars overhead and the certificate folded in his jacket pocket. He said, "Good essay, kid." Cole looked at his father on the motorcycle. The leather vest and the patches and the chain and the scarred hands on the grips, everything exactly as it had always been and always would be real in the way of things that have never tried to be anything other than what they are. He said, "Thanks for coming tonight." Reed looked at him for a moment with those pale, calibrated eyes. He said, "I will always come." 3 words. He said them at the same low volume as everything else and without additional weight because they did not require additional weight. They were simply true, and true things, in Reed Dalton's understanding, stated themselves without needing embellishment. Cole put on his helmet. He climbed on behind his father, his hands finding the back of the vest, the leather worn smooth at the seams, the patches stiff under his fingers. The whole familiar geography of a thing he had known his entire life. Reed kick-started the Softail. The engine caught on the second kick, the exhaust note filling the parking lot with the sound that had preceded his father's entrance into every significant moment. Cole could remember the low, rolling declaration of a machine maintained by the man who built it and ridden by a man who had decided every day for 15 years to be present for whatever came next. They rolled out of the parking lot and onto the street. The engine settled into its traveling note as they picked up speed lower and steadier than the idle, the sound of distance being covered at a pace that does not apologize for itself. Cole felt the vibration through his hands on the vest and through his legs against the seat and through the night air moving against the front of his jacket. They rode through Harlan in the May dark past the grain elevator and the implement dealer and the diner with the peeling sign past the school where the gymnasium was still lit from the inside. Past the streets Cole had walked every morning for 4 years, with his backpack straps cutting into his shoulders and his breath making small white clouds in the cold air and the weight of everything he was ashamed of pressing down on him. He looked at it all from the back of the Softail with the wind in his face and his father's back in front of him and the engine beneath him and the stars very large overhead. They turned onto their street. The houses were lit from inside the ordinary illuminated squares of people settling into their Thursday evenings. Reed pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, and the silence came back, the deep residential quiet of a small Montana town late on a spring night. Cole climbed off the bike and pulled off his helmet. Reed swung his leg over and stood. They went inside. Reed put the kettle on without asking, which meant 2 cups, which he didn't always do. Cole sat at the kitchen table and set the certificate on it and looked at the gold seal with the fingerprint smudge. The table was clear, nothing on it but the certificate in the wood grain and the ordinary marks of years of use. Reed set a mug in front of him, cocoa from the tin above the refrigerator, the powdered kind. Cole wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth come through the ceramic. Reed sat across from him with his own mug. They sat in the kitchen in the quiet house, and the light was the ordinary overhead light it had always been, and the refrigerator made its low hum, and the engine parts sat on the tarp in the corner where they lived until they were needed. From outside, at the edge of hearing, the garage radio had been left on. A steel guitar, the signal drifting in and out with the night wind. Cole said, "I am hungry." Reed said, "I know." He said it without looking up from his mug. "You are always hungry." He stood up and opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it. The way he stood in front of things, he was assessing, taking inventory of what was present and what could be made from it. Cole put his chin in his hand and watched his father look into the refrigerator. Reed took out eggs and the heel of a bread loaf and something in a container and set them on the counter. He found a pan on the hook above the stove and set it on the burner with the particular efficiency of a man who does not measure anything and does not need to. Cole watched those hands. He watched them crack the eggs against the edge of the pan, the motion clean, and practice the shells dropping into the trash without looking. He watched them move the bread into the toaster and check the contents of the container and add something to the pan, all of it done with the same quiet, functional precision that had fixed engines and turned wrenches and set a piece of metal down on a teacher's desk in a 3rd-grade classroom on a gray April morning and changed the shape of an entire day. The pan began to make its sound. The kitchen filled with the smell of eggs and butter and the faint char of toast beginning. Reed worked at the stove without commentary. Cole sat at the kitchen table with his hands around the mug of cocoa and the certificate with the fingerprint on the gold seal in front of him and the garage radio drifting in through the window and the stars very large outside over Harlan, Montana, over the grain elevator and the implement dealer and the school gymnasium, now going dark over the streets and the houses and the flat grasslands stretching to the foothills over everything that was exactly what it was and nothing else. His father set a plate in front of him. Cole looked at it. He looked up at his father standing at the counter with his own plate, the vest still on the chain at his hip, the scarred hands holding the plate without any ceremony at all. Cole picked up his fork. Reed sat back down across from him. They ate.